Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatirons Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Flatirons Syndicate Podcast. We are here today for episode number, oh man, don't quote me on this, I think 117. We've got a special guest with us who some of you might know, some of you might not know. If you do know him, you probably know him as 900 BRZ on YouTube, but this is Brian is joining us today. And Brian, the reason I asked you to come on and chat is because you have done something really interesting and really significant, I think, in that you have a new 2022 BRZ, and you kind of got a sense that there was something going on with the car, and I should say that you like to track the car. That's the, kind of one of the primary things you do with it. And so you decided to gather some data and get a picture of what's going on with the oiling system in the BRZ, and you found out some really interesting information. And I want to get to that, but before we do, let's maybe go back just a little bit. And how did you find the BRZ in the first place? Is this your first Subaru? What got you into the seat in the first place?
Yeah, I actually have a very boring car history. So my first car was a 2003 Volkswagen Golf, and it was a manual, but it had 150 horsepower at the crank. Who knows what it was at the wheel?
Mm-hmm.
And I had that car for 15 years, so
Wow.
quite a long time. Part of that time I lived in New York City, so it was back in California where I'm from. And I had a second car in New York for 11 months, which was a lease takeover, and that was a BMW X2. Not a very sporty car, despite it being a BMW. And then I moved back to California, and kind of at that point had an opportunity to finally explore an interest of mine for a long time, which was tracking a car and driving a car at the limit. So I actually kind of grew up with racing in my family. So my grandfather raced jalopies on dirt tracks in San Diego back in the day, and my uncle raced on dirt tracks as well. And then my grandfather actually started building racing engines and crewing for my uncle. And then my grandfather built racing engines kind of for the rest of his professional life, and built racing engines for the Baja 1000 and Baja 500. So I was always kind of surrounded by it, but didn't really have an opportunity until more recently to get into it myself. And so yeah, I knew, okay, I want to start going to the track. I want to learn how to drive well at the limit. And so I actually started with autocross and then got into track after that, which I know you guys have talked about in the past as well.
It's a starting path for many people.
Yeah. But yeah, it was basically for me. I knew I wanted something that was going to be approachable at the limit, and so BRZ was kind of at the top of the list. I was actually also considering an MX-5 Miata.
Oh yeah.
And for various reasons, it was ironically easier for me to get a 2022 BRZ than the Miata at the time. Supply chain stuff.
Was this in 2022? Like,
this was in late 2021, actually. So I have a very early car. The build date is 10/21. And yeah, so I ended up having an opportunity. There was a car coming to a dealer nearby, and I called him on the phone and reserved it sight unseen, and drove it around a little bit, and it kind of checked all the boxes that I was looking for. So yeah, it was actually a fairly easy decision at that time.
Well, and those early cars, I mean, those first BRZs to roll off the trailers, I mean, those were hard to get. So you were fortunate to stumble into one like that. That's awesome.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and so it sounds like you got the BRZ with the whole idea in mind of learning to drive and taking this car to the track. How long did it take you to actually do that, or was it something that came pretty close after just getting the delivery of the car?
No, it took me a while. So I probably didn't get it onto my first track that I took it to was Button Willow, and
Okay.
it was almost a year before I did that, but I did a handful of it. I started autocrossing it in March of 2022. So I did a handful of autocross events before I took it to the track. And then since then, I've been going to since I took it to the track, which was I think it was in November of 22. I've been going kind of 1 to 2 track events per month since then.
Wow.
And so have kind of tried to go up that curve quickly, still pretty humble about what I need to learn and things like that, but have also done a fair amount of sim racing or sim practice in order to learn the car dynamics and things like that.
Just out of curiosity, what is your sim game of choice?
So if I want to try to simulate the car that I'm actually driving, I use Assetto Corsa, and then I do iRacing and stuff for fun as well.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
And then I guess just that is an inroad for many of us, and for sure. And it's sim racing is it's reasonably or more attainable for so many of us to go out there and play with. When you finally took the car into track, how did you feel, or did you feel like that prepared you? Did it kind of like was it not as stressful and not as surprising to take the car on the track for the first time, or do you think that there's a real sim racing is one thing and actually driving on the track is different, and like they're kind of related, but they're not maybe as related as some people might think?
Yeah, I think the thing that it was really helpful for me to experience on a sim is understanding track layout and kind of which gear I need to be in and braking points and things like that. So when you get on the track, it feels familiar. It feels like you're not, learning you're not learning navigation and orientation on the track. What I don't think I was really prepared for is just the feeling of lateral G and the feeling of I still have stock seats in the car. So the feeling of being somewhat unsupported.
Right.
I also have a pretty narrow torso, so there's actually quite a lot of room for me
sliding
to
around
kind of wiggle.
yeah.
And so that, I think, in my first couple track days, I wasn't really at the limit, even though I thought I was, just because of I think that feeling of, okay, one, there's much higher consequence obviously than in the sim, but also just physically, like, it feels like I'm at the limit, even if my tires aren't quite there yet.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like in a sim rig at your house, there's not the movement, and you don't have the extra sensory stuff like of what else is going on in the car, the smells and the movement, all that jazz. But there's a lot of important pieces to it, and I think they're both very fun in their own right, for sure. And one usually leads to the other. Just kind of depends on where people start with it.
Totally.
So once you started tracking the BRZ, I mean, what were your initial impressions? Like, were you like, this is everything that I expected, it's working just the way that I had hoped, or what were your thoughts?
I mean, basically, yeah, I think it was I felt like I had enough power for what I was, for my skill level. I kind of heard a lot of people talking about the torque dip and a little bit of the lack of power on the previous generation platform. And I actually still haven't driven a previous generation BRZ at all, actually. But for me, that was never really a problem. I mean, there are certain straightaways that you can always have more power, but
Sure.
That's not my limitation for sure. And it was also my first rear-wheel drive car, and so that was I would say somewhat of a new experience, but I think I had done enough time in the sim to generally understand it. And then I think really learning how to understand and have good car control is something that I'm still working on. And want to get more experience with. But I felt like it was kind of a fairly intuitive learning process with a car.
Yeah, and fair to say that you pretty much had fun right out of the gate.
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
Nice. So we've got to talk about the elephant in the room. So at some point, I'm guessing there was some kind of kernel of inspiration to make you go, I think there's something going on here, and to explore it. And I guess maybe as a starting point, what was that initial inspiration to kind of not just get out there and drive the car, not just working on driving the car, but actually get some kind of method to collect data and actually get a picture of what the car is doing, what the engine is doing as you're driving it on the track, in addition to taking it to the track and utilizing it that way?
Yeah, so this kind of coincided with me moving up to the Bay Area from San Diego, where I was before. And I think while I was in San Diego at that time, the kind of biggest issue was the RTV issue.
Right.
And
let's explain that just in case there's somebody that's not familiar with what that was.
Yeah, so there's instead of using O-rings or other types of gaskets in various parts of the engine, they use a liquid kind of adhesive or sealant in order to seal different parts of the car together. So cam covers and the oil pan and things like that. And people were dropping the oil pan and seeing that this RTV had collected inside of the oil pickup. And when you see pictures of it, it looks quite scary. It's kind of blocking the passage of oil.
Right.
And then you can, once you learn a little bit more about it, you learn, okay, there's a little bit more to this. There's a 5-sided screen that kind of is designed to collect various materials that may end up there and prevent them from circulating the oiling system. And so even if there's some coverage on that face that's immediately visible, there's still a pathway for oil to pass around it. And the amount of RTV, the sealant that gets trapped there is different in basically each car. So I had kind of been seeing some of this, was somewhat concerned about it, but not really enough to drop the pan and look at it myself.
And the other thing that's worth mentioning here is this. So using RTV silicone to seal parts of the engine and the oil pan and stuff, that is not anything new. Subaru's been doing that for many, many years, going back to the EJs and all that. But the thing that was new is having what the assumption is that too much was applied initially. And like when you've got two surfaces that are coming down, if you've got too much sealant between those two surfaces, it kind of gushes out on the sides. And what can happen when you've got that basically a glob on the side, as it gets hot, as oil and stuff is moving around, it potentially could get knocked off. And then that's where potentially there's these pieces of silicone that like dislodge from one of these mating surfaces, and then it's in the oil. And that's what people were seeing. And that's with these new FA24 engines, that was something that was basically a new occurrence. Yeah. And that's what got people's attention when people started to drop these pans and figure this stuff out.
Yeah, and it's even not just Subaru who's using the RTV sealant, it's Porsche and lots of other manufacturers as well.
Yeah, it's very standard.
Yeah.
So was that the inspiration to kind of
not really.
Picture?
That was the kind of like first reliability concern that I became aware of, and I actually talked to my grandfather about it. And you have to be still somewhat aware that is a failure mode of the car. The other time that we saw this was in the previous generation car after the valve spring recalls. Some of them were having excessive RTV applied, and there were failures that were kind of, as far as I understand, like definitively caused by RTV in those pickups. So it is a potential problem, but it wasn't enough of a problem. I figured, okay, if this is the case, like I'm very likely to be covered under warranty, and so I'm not gonna do anything about it.
Sure.
When I moved up to the Bay Area, then really quickly I got kind of assimilated into a group of friends who are all tracking the same car.
Oh, sure.
And it was really a lot of their research that I'm kind of backpacking onto in a way.
Okay.
And so there was particularly two drivers who all the way back, I think it was November of 2022. So at the time that I was gearing up for my first track day, they had essentially already discovered this issue. And so they had figured out a way to install the sensor and get that analog signal converted to a digital signal and injected into the CAN bus, which we can explain later, I guess, because there's a lot to that. But they had kind of already figured this out. And in my last video where I walked through the Killer Bee experiment, and I gave a little bit of the background of the history of the development of that product, and it's intertwined with the story of first discovering that there was this issue. So one of the drivers who goes by No Street Racing 86 on YouTube, so he had posted on the FT86 Club forum that, hey, we've observed this issue. Here's a YouTube video documenting it. And it's a video of him on, I think at that point, just one track, but he actually had several tracks and showed this problem. And the Killer Bee Motorsport folks were one of the people that were kind of talking back and forth with him about the issue. And it's funny, in that thread, you can see initially their responses, oh, this may be related to the valve timing and things like that. And then the representative from Killer Bee had actually missed the video. And so then when he watched the video, he said, oh, this looks like a real problem, like significant.
And I guess at this point, I should say two things. One is I'll put links to both of your videos, the most recent videos, the one where you have the documentation of the issue, and then the Killer Bee video that you mentioned in the description. But if you haven't watched those yet, this might be a good opportunity to pause this video, go back and watch those. They're very well done, very informative, but they're not terribly long. And then once you have that backstory, then come here. The other thing I should say is what we're talking about here, this problem that you're mentioning is not the RTV silicone. This is something else. So maybe like kind of fill in the details of this new concern that was brought to your attention.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, so what those initial videos were demonstrating is a pretty noticeable drop in oil pressure in certain conditions. And so one, I think the baseline was when you're at above 4,000 RPM, the oil pressure in this car tends to be around 60 PSI. And then we'd see a significant divergence from that kind of nominal 60 PSI number in right-hand corners. And it's not exactly as straightforward as every right-hand corner, but it's particularly right-hand corners that have rapid lateral acceleration direction changes. So you can think of like S's, or we see it a lot in crests of hills and right-hand turns, either like immediately following that or like included in that corner. And so, there's various turns. Laguna Seca, I think it's turn 4 that we see it. Sonoma, turn 2, we see it. And then Thunderhill my videos kind of exclusively cover Thunderhill right now. And that's because it's kind of a very accessible place to test this. The cost is cheaper to run cars there. Thunderhill, we see it in a lot of turns. There's kind of a number of different track layouts that you can do at Thunderhill. There's an east track and a west track, and then there's a combined layout where you go on both of those tracks with connectors in between. And so there we see it on turns 3 east, turns 5 east, and we see it on the connector between the two, and then we see it at turn 5 west, and we see it at turn 8 west. So as you're going around that track, you're dropping into 30s, so that's like half the pressure that we expect, and then you're even dropping into 20s and mid to low 20s sometimes in some of those corners. And so this was kind of like these friends had already basically like discovered this problem.
And let's, because you said No Street Racing 86 is one of them. Who is like who
The other,
else do we want to
yeah,
mention?
yeah, great call. The other one is Track and Build on YouTube.
Okay.
And they both have their own videos kind of documenting this problem. When I got involved, the initial way that I kind of got involved is I just volunteered to test the product for Killer Bee. And
Okay.
then No Street Racing offered to build me the same CAN injection. So this way of taking the analog signal and injecting it into the CAN feed. I had already purchased the AIM Solo 2, so I had the ability to log data.
Okay.
And he said, okay, I can help you get the instrumentation sorted out on your car. So that way you can do this testing.
That's the data that you guys got that is what is so cool and so compelling, because I think, boy, I mean, things like this, they're starting to become available. A lot of this kind of data acquisition, what's different here is like people with access ports, you've been able to data log for a long time, but it's all sensors that it has to be something that the car came with. You can't really add something to it to data log. Like for a little while, O2 sensors or wideband could be plumbed in, but that was about it.
Hmm.
So the ability to kind of like pick and choose a sensor, like I want to look at oil pressure and just put it in there and then data log it, was challenging. So like what you've done, like it's very cool that you were able to find a way, or you all were able to find a way to take a sensor, add it to the engine, and then, yeah, like I said, inject it onto the CAN bus, onto this basically CAN network in the car, so you can actually data log it. Because this is, so in some ways it's kind of a new frontier where you don't have to really empirically look at things after the fact to try and run down what is going on, what's happening. The ability to see live data and then correlate it to the car on track, which is what you've done in your videos, and I assume they did as well.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, it's like that it makes the situation so much clearer, and that's what's so interesting.
Yeah, I think that's what's so powerful about it is a lot of people, if you look at Facebook groups or forums, they were saying, based on anecdotal data of a couple of different failures that I've seen, and I even mentioned in the video that was part of the inspiration for me getting involved in the first place was anecdotal failures. But there was one podcast in particular that I listened to, and someone said, once we see 200 of these failures, they'll believe that there's a real issue. And that was also one of my motivations to make the video. Is one, that's a very slow way to learn that there's a problem, and it's a very expensive way to learn that there's a problem, and it may not even be possible. Like, it's very difficult for anybody other than the manufacturer to really know what the failure rate of these cars are.
Sure.
You rely on basically volunteer submissions of failure cases, and then even if you do that, you can get invalid data if people are lying about it. So it's a very difficult and slow way to learn, I think. And so it's one of the things that is I think pretty unique and cool about being part of this community in the Bay Area of people who are tracking is there's a very high representation of people with either mechanical engineering backgrounds or software engineering backgrounds. And so, we're kind of more wired to say, okay, how do we actually prove that there's a problem? And how do we find that problem as early as possible? My background is in software engineering, and you try to find bugs in your software as early as possible. If you have to ship them all the way to production in order to find that there's a bug and impact users, then you're gonna cause a lot more problems, and it's actually going to be harder to track down those bugs once they're in a production environment than if you can do things like write unit tests that prove that your code works beforehand. So it's a lot of the same kind of methodology that goes into it, and thinking process of, okay, if there's an issue, is there a way that we can identify at least a contributing factor to this issue,
Mm-hmm.
and do it in a way that's much further upstream. And so
Yeah,
that was, I think, what was so appealing to this approach as opposed to just, waiting for failures.
for sure. I mean, it's and again, it's like the data is compelling, and yeah, you basically you're using the exact same approach and applying it to this circumstance, and this is what is giving the community like a leap forward, because like you mentioned, Killer Bee is a great company to work with. I mean, they specialize in all things oil delivery,
Mhm.
and so to have that kind of data to get it onto their radar, so now that they can have their engineering team start to look at the cars and what they can think the problem is. Um, yeah, I mean it's one of those things where somebody's going to find a solution here, and having the data to basically get the attention and the focus on like what needs to be looked at, how you can collect the data, what data you really need to pay attention to, and then any kind of solutions, which we can get to here in a bit, to actually put them into practice, put them into testing, and see like, okay, did it actually make a difference? You know what you're looking for. You know the performance that you're trying to reach. It's just going to speed the process for either Subaru and or the aftermarket to get to the point where, okay, now we've got the resolution. Now the car is working better. Now you as the enthusiast can go out there, apply this fix and go out there and enjoy the car more and have hopefully better peace of mind about the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really important as well, the kind of having the control and then the experiment data there to say, did this attempt at a mitigation actually work?
Yeah.
A lot of when I put out the first video, we didn't have an attempt at a mitigation. We were just describing a problem.
Right.
And at that point, there were a lot of comments on the video which were, oh, just add a baffle. You have to add a baffle to all track cars. It's normal. This isn't like a new problem. And then you have videos, or you have comments saying the only solution is dry sump. And really, we just don't know yet. There may be a baffle that we can put in, but No Street Racing and Track and Build now each have baffles in their car, and it's not just that you grab any baffle off any shelf and you put it in and it solved the problem. They've shown, in certain conditions there's slight improvements, but it's definitely not solving the problem to the extent that we're comfortable with.
Yeah.
So they may also be like taking those baffles out and trying new ones,
Sure.
in addition to me. And then, when we find something, then everyone can just go straight to that one and not have to do all the testing for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess one other thing just about the mitigations and the way that we're going about it is, my opinion, there's also been a lot of suggestions, oh, just put an AccuSump on and then you'll be good. So oil accumulator. But I think first, I'm kind of thinking about it in stages, which is if we can find a purely physical mechanical solution, which would be a baffle that at least improves things, then we give people some options of saying,
right,
well, if you want to also add an AccuSump, you have baseline better oiling before the AccuSump is involved. So that's always good. Or if you don't want to have the additional kind of failure points and complexity of having an AccuSump in the system, then maybe you can get away with just the baffle. And then some people, once there's a solution available commercially, will probably want to go all the way to a dry sump. But again, there's a huge range of, if we're doing this work not just for ourselves but for the whole community, then we want to be able to provide useful mitigations for people on different budgets and with different appetites for complexity.
Yeah, I mean, complexity is a huge consideration, and it's very easy to be kind of nonchalant about how much complexity something like an AccuSump or especially a dry sump brings to the party. I can tell you from a dry sump standpoint, it's a lot. It's a lot, but it's well worth it once you do it. But it's something where, like for a street car, I mean, I would never recommend to try and install a dry sump on a car that didn't come with it from the factory on a daily driven car or a street driven car, because there's just the oil tank, the oil lines, there's so much to it that it's really not it's not optimal to add to some kind of to a street car.
Yeah.
And a lot of times there's concessions that you're making to get everything to fit with the dry sump that just wouldn't. I would not want to make all these concessions on my daily driven street car. I'm
Totally.
sure that there's like a couple of people out there. But you know, to each their own, and to a certain extent with an AccuSump, like less invasive, a little bit easier to install, but it still brings complexity to the table.
Mhm.
And there's got to be some kind of a mechanical thing. I mean, and again, like you guys did such an impressive data collection for the baseline that it like you really kind of pinpointed where the problem is, and like kind of the proof that to me the proof that something like an AccuSump, while it would solve the problem for a track car, shouldn't be, there should be another option. There is the fact that it's only right-hand turns. If everything's working fine on the left-hand turns and it's only on the right-hand turns, then it's got to be something in the geometry, something in the build, something in the layout that is being, like the failure condition being only one side. Like if it was either way,
Mhm.
you know, maybe more likely that something like an AccuSump would be essential. But the fact that it's just one turn, that makes me feel like there's got to be some kind of change, modification, what have you, that will then get it to the point where you get similar oil pressure behaviors in both corners. And then at that point, that should be good for the majority of the people out there.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but we're now working on something, or there's something in the works that we are hopeful will be another kind of possible mitigation that we can test out, and hopefully have something else there to look forward to.
Yeah.
But I guess one other thing that I just wanted to mention about some of the motivation behind what we're doing is, one, there was this idea that you know, we should just wait for more failures to occur. But the other idea was, you know, if you're not an advanced level driver and you're not on, you know, 200 tread wear tires or even grippier tires than that, then you don't really need to worry about it. And you know, when I was hearing people say that, I already knew that that wasn't really true, because I was able to cause these pressure drops to occur. There is a matter of extent here, and we could talk about that as well.
Sure.
But I was able to cause these pressure drops to occur within my first 10 track days, and on quite low grip tires. The tires that we're using are GT Radial Champiro SX2, and my car and No Street Racing 86 car have 225 tread width. So these are, it comes out of the stock. The stock tread width is 215 on the PS4 tires from Michelin, and we don't have scientific evidence to prove this, but we think that grip levels very similar between these two tires, and the SX2 arguably have even less grip than the OEM tires. Sure. It's a little bit confusing to people because there's this tread wear rating, and the SX2 tread wear is 260. And I don't remember, I think the PS4s might be 320 or something like that.
Yeah.
But tread wear is a little bit, it can be misleading if you're making comparisons across different manufacturers.
Yeah, it doesn't mean nearly as much as it used to. There's like for a lot of time attack, some of the groups limit you to 200 tread wear tires, and then for better or for worse, probably for both, some of the tire manufacturers that really wanted to cater and be involved in time attack said, well, we're going to stamp a 200 on there, but we're going to put whatever rubber we want onto this tire. And then, you know, people figured out like, oh, like the really sticky 200 tread wears are like the Yokohama like AO52s and one of the Advans or Advan AO52s, and yeah, just like they figure out these handful of treadwear 200 treadwear tires that are like super sticky, like within 2 seconds of a racing slick sticky, but they're 200 treadwear. And it's like, yeah, there's between tire size and tire rating, it's kind of the Wild West out there right now.
Yeah, my understanding is there is like a government mandated test that they do, and then they have to score a certain amount for like the longevity, the expected life span of that tire, and it's extrapolated out from test, which is not covering tens of thousands of miles.
Yep.
But if their rating is that, let's say they last for 10,000 miles, and so hypothetically, they're perfectly able to market it as a tire that only lasts for 5,000 miles as well.
Sure.
So that's how sometimes you could get a tire with lower grip that
it's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also the compounds, maybe you can make a stickier tire that lasts longer now than you could 10 years ago.
That's true.
So,
that too. Yeah.
They've gotten more advanced in general. But yeah, these tires are not that we're using are pretty comparable to stock tires. And so that was also an important thing that I was a motivation behind making the video is there are some things that we knew from doing this test that weren't broadly known in the community. And so we just wanted people to kind of understand, I guess, the things that we had learned.
Yeah. And it's good that you know that, but then we're able to showcase that, because then that kind of paints a much clearer picture of, like, if anybody else that's watching this, that's watched your videos, that has a BRZ, that wants to track it, like, how much should you be paying attention to this? And obviously it's worth paying attention to, no matter what your skill level, no matter if you're keeping the 100% stock tires on the car, and that's as far as you want to go. It's something that's worth paying mind to.
Yeah. My goal is definitely not to scare people away from the car, or my goal is also not to say, to throw shade on a manufacturer and say anything about their ability to do engineering and things like that. It's certainly not the goal. The goal is just to say, this is what we've learned about the capabilities of the car. As most of the people in the community will be driving it. And so and the video was really originally intended for people who are taking their car to the track. So it's why there's an oil cooler on these cars, and we state that, but we're not really trying to prove it on the street. We're not trying to prove it with 0W20 oil. We're trying to say, hey, for people who are going to the track, this is a very light track build, and this is the kind of like real data that we're seeing about the oiling performance.
So I guess maybe one, like, kind of in regards to that, and just kind of like to pull back big picture. So it sounds like it's basically three of you with that have this car, and then maybe a fourth that has the 2-liter BRZ is another baseline. Have any of you had any engine failures to date?
No one in that particular group is, but in the broader group, just in the local Bay Area kind of group of people that I know, there have been 2 failures in that group. One that happened, I think it was, I don't exactly remember the date, probably about beginning of 2023. And that is still kind of like an open case. These failures are taking a long time to be addressed, unfortunately. And then the other one happened more recently, and that car is still in the process of being torn down. And manufacturers involved in that, and the dealers involved in that.
Gotcha. And the reason I ask is just like, context is another important piece of the puzzle, and basically to exactly what you said. It's this is something to be aware of, but if you yourself are taking your car to the track, say twice a month, or 10 track days a year or something like that, and you've done at least 10 track days, probably 20 or more at this point, that there's this behavior that is not ideal, but it has not caused an engine failure yet. Though the yet is kind of like that's the important part of that expression. What you're seeing is definitely something that's not ideal. It's definitely something that over time there could be additive damage that's happening as a possibility. But at the same time, you also have not had that failure, because I think, and the reason that I want to kind of frame it that way is I think that for a lot of us, the first time you take your car to the track, it can be a scary experience. There's a lot of excitement, but there can be a lot of fear to it. And when you have something like this that crops up, it's like this extra thing that would be easy to kind of take over your perspective about what you're doing, and it could really certainly dissuade people from taking any chance or going at all in that direction. And I think that it's definitely something to be aware of, certainly, but it's something where I don't think it should be something that completely stops everybody with a BRZ from tracking the car.
Yeah. I think it's important to keep the risk in proportion.
Mhm.
And anytime you're going on the track, you're accepting a higher degree of risk than you
Yep.
do, driving the car on the street.
Yep.
And so this is one component of that risk, and I think it's something that we can do the work to try to minimize that risk. But the track is an environment with elevated risk in general.
Yep.
And during the time that I've been going to the track, I've seen incidents that have nothing to do with engine performance that have occurred as well.
Sure.
And so
Sure.
I think it's just something that you have to kind of be aware of that risk. And I would encourage people to think about it and think about what their risk tolerance is. And as long as they can deal with the consequences of that, there's multiple ways to deal with the consequences. There's track day insurance. There's some people may not push their car as hard because they're thinking about it. Or there's if it won't be a life-changing event. Obviously it's always life-changing when something bad happens, but
for sure.
If you're going to still be able to pay your rent and do what you need to do, then you can appreciate that risk, but then put it out of your mind when you're actually on the track. And so I think of this as one of several risks that exist on track. And
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, having covered that, let's look forward. I mean, the points of optimism to me are, one, you've got a manufacturer like Killer Bee that is paying attention to this, that you're testing some products. I mean, it sounds like from watching the video of your results, you did not get the degree of improvement that it was hoped, but sometimes you got to remember that finding out what doesn't work is a really important step to finding out what does work. So things are still moving forward there. And there's other manufacturers and other people like Baffle plates and Baffle design. I mean, it feels like there's a real opportunity. There's likely some kind of Baffle design that's going to make a good improvement.
Right.
What other things are on the horizons, or can you talk about any other causes for optimism?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we're looking at now. So after we saw this test data come back from the Killer Bee experiment day, so I guess I didn't really explain the experiment in a lot of detail yet, but we took my track out, and we took my car to Thunder Hill, and we put it on the 5-mile track. And we also have we had a FA20 that's owned by a friend named Miles, who's in our kind of same community. And we went out and tracked both those cars that same day. And we were able to establish this baseline data. And then from No Street Racing, I'll get into a little bit more detail here, but he had already had a Baffle installed. So we used an earlier track day on on Thunder Hill West for his car, just so we had consistent, baseline data for all three cars. And then I separately tested my car on Thunder Hill 5-mile, and I enlisted the help of a local instructor, Joe McGuigan, who's affiliated with, or he kind of runs, or is one of the people who runs a local track day organization called Speed SF. And he basically volunteered to set baseline laps and then experiment laps later in my car. So we were able to test with a number of different drivers. So you have me with about 10 track days of experience. No Street Racing drove my car as well. And then we had Joe drive my car. And so we have very consistent lap times set before the experiment Baffle was installed and then after it was installed.
Okay.
And we were able to look at that data and overlay it on top of each other, and kind of see what the performance looks like. And generally, I think the overview of how that data looks is, one, the pressure drops are very consistent. So if you drive, with the same inputs on the same track, you will see effectively like the same pressure drops. And so that gives us confidence that the test has integrity and that it's reproducible. And then just as maybe a side point, just this week on Facebook, in one of the track groups, somebody, now forgetting the group that they're with, a kind of like tuner shop as well.
Okay.
But they set up their own instrumentation. They use the same sensor and the same data logger, but everything in between is different.
Okay.
And they were able to show pressure drops as well. And so that's great to see. Well, it's not great to see because they're pressure drops.
Right.
But it validates the way that we've instrumented the car, that we have an independent person kind of having similar results. So then when we went to the second day with this Baffle installed, we were able to see consistent results. The drops weren't meaningfully different between the two. And so that allowed us to basically eliminate this the hypothesis that Kilby proposed. And the hypothesis that they proposed was that the oil was surging forward into the timing cover on braking, and then kind of getting stranded there as you apply lateral G, and oil will slosh over to the side. Whatever oil is in the timing cover, there are ways for it to drain back into the sump, or into the to the lower pan where the pickup is. But those may not actually be effective when there's that much lateral G applied. So the idea was it will reduce the oil volume in the sump, and it will basically cause it to starve quicker. If the oil is flowing up into the pickup and being distributed through the engine, that volume in the sump is going to be reduced to the point where the pickup won't have any more oil available to it. So that was the hypothesis. The fact that we found that the mitigation that they designed didn't work, it was, I think, like you said, it's not the result that we were hoping for. We were hoping we could just publish, hey, we found a fix. Unfortunately, it's not the case, but at least we're able to now focus on the thing that we think is the next most likely solution. And what we're thinking about right now is actually in some ways a more traditional baffle. Most of the baffles that are on the market right now for this product are just kind of one horizontal sheet of metal with some perforations in it for oil return. And the idea would be that as the oil sloshes over to one side, it would be retained by this horizontal component. But we've seen that can improve things on flat right-hand turns, but it's not really working when there's elevation change involved.
Yeah. This is kind of like so there's a similar product for the EJ series engine, and there's a lot of testing there, but now the new pans have gone to basically having vertical baffles and stuff, so that you're actually trying to put vertical fences on either side of the pickup, so that instead of just trying to keep the oil from crawling up the side of the pan itself, and granted in the BRZ, the pan is two pieces. There's like this upper block, and then the actual lower pan that we're talking about here is fairly small, not, I'll say shallow. Shallow is probably overstating it, but compared to an EJ pan, shallow. So putting that flat plane there, it keeps it from crawling up the sides, but the putting fences around the pickup, I mean, that's a much more direct way to kind of keep the oil right at the pickup where you need it.
Yeah, so in some ways it's a more traditional approach for these engines, and so that's kind of what we're looking at now. And so the idea is the horizontal baffle will try to keep some of the oil there, but it can still slosh away. So if you reduce the kind of volume of space that you're trying to contain, and kind of, because the other thing is the pickup is offset, we can kind of offset this chamber that we're able to create. And so that's the idea that we're working on now. There's one product on the market from a company called Kazama that has an interesting design that's doing something similar to this. They have a single vertical partition, and it has a metal trapdoor that's a one-way door. So we thought that was really interesting. And then one of the people in our group, who's a mechanical engineer, is actually working on his own design for this as well. That's kind of inspired by some of these things that we've seen work in other engines. Sure. And we've been looking at a lot of different engines, going back to the M96 engine that Porsche made, and then they later made this revision to it called X51, where they kind of modified some of the baffling in it. So we're looking at what Killer B has done in the past and what Porsche has done in the past, and trying to learn as much as we can about how to approach this problem. But that's kind of in the works now, and that'll be the Baffle that I try next.
Okay.
Or if everything goes according to plan, that will be the Baffle that I try next.
Nice. Well, and again, like this is the great thing with the very comprehensive set of baseline data that you have, is like all of these new solutions, you're gonna, like, once something works, you all are going to be able to really definitively point to the fact that it works. And that's what is so cool about all of the work that you guys have done to collect all of this data. You basically have done a huge service to all of us in the community, so that once the solution is found, we'll know it for sure. In regards to testing, you have a control oil, which is, I think, Motul 8100 530 is the control for everything. And you had mentioned, just in terms of other testing, you'd mentioned trying different weight of oil, I think, is one thing. And you'd mentioned, I think, trying to overfill, like put more oil in. Are you still considering testing some of that, or have you?
Yeah, so Track and Build on YouTube. So I'm basically, because I'm trying to have my car be set up in a way that we can test all these baffles, and that was kind of the objective when we went into instrumenting my car. I'm gonna try to stick to this 5W30 oil, but it's been really hot
as the
here.
Control.
Yeah, just to reduce the amount of variables. No Street Racing and Track and Build don't quite have that same constraint.
Sure.
And so they've switched to 5W40. And the idea there is, it's been really hot here in California. So at the day of our test, it was 170 degrees.
Whoa.
107, just to be clear about that. 107 degrees Fahrenheit. And so really the temperatures that I was seeing, I would actually be more comfortable with a thicker viscosity or a higher viscosity oil in those conditions. But it's hard to control these. Like the best way, if we weren't self-funding this, or we had support from a manufacturer, or just a bigger budget for this, we would be able to install the Baffle on site and test it the same day. But even then, you're getting variance from morning to afternoon. So it's hard to control these entirely.
And important to note, you are monitoring temperature also.
Yes,
so you have pressure and temperature, and so you have track position and all of those other variables. So you, like, because I think you're getting up in the vicinity of 230 to 240. I think sometimes you're a little bit over 240 degrees oil temps.
Right.
So as long as you know that even if it's on a hot day, for the test lap, that the oil is in that same 230 to 245 window, that it would be reasonably comparable.
Yeah. And
harder to keep it there if it's 107 degrees out, but yeah.
Yeah, we can kind of choose the laps that have comparable temperatures as well. So that's another thing that we can do. But what Track and Build has been able to do is, he's been looking at some other comparisons. So there were a lot of people who suggested, oh, you can switch to a heavier weight and that might resolve things. And so he posted on YouTube, there's, I guess not too many people know about this, but some people know that you can make posts that are like more like a traditional social media post on YouTube. So he has some cool data visualizations that he's put together with his data. And he shows a direct comparison of 5W30 and 5W40, and we're able to show still consistent pressure drops, maybe slightly better performance with 5W40, but it's not a magic bullet for kind of solving things. The overfill, the idea behind the overfill is if you have oil sloshing away from the pickup, but you just increase the total amount of oil that's available, you may still be able to provide that pickup oil. And so we haven't done too much testing on this. I did on our experiment day, I did a half-liter overfill at the end of the day, but I was kind of exhausted by that point, to be honest. So my times were not very competitive. Overall, we saw basically the same shape of like the telemetry if you look at the oil pressure, but the magnitude of the drops were not as big. And that's really due to the pace. So it's something I mentioned earlier, where this is really, it's kind of on any wet sump. If you push if you are able to generate enough lateral G, you'll probably be able to create pressure drops eventually. And it depends on the layout of the engine and the geometry of the engine, like you said. MX-5 Miata engine, there's a video that Savage Geese put out where Dave Coleman, who's one of the engineers on that platform, he was talking about some of the design parameters, and he said that the Miata was designed for consistent oiling to 1.4 G. And so even on that engine, if you're generating 1.5 G, that oiling pressure is probably not going to be consistent anymore.
It's possible,
And so, we don't have any data from Miata, so we don't know if the engineers achieved their objective or if they surpassed it, or we don't really know anything about, or I personally don't know anything about the oiling performance of that engine, but at least it's stated that their goal was 1.4 G.
And you have to assume that Subaru intended people to track this car. And I mean, the hope is that Subaru's paying attention. I think it's got to be safe to say at this point that they're aware of the problem. I mean, somebody in Subaru somewhere is aware of this, and that they would be trying to improve it. I think that's the hope for all of us, is that they're I mean, they have the engineers that design the car. Like this didn't come out of nowhere, and they've probably have a couple of guys that their whole specialty is oil pickups and oil pans. So I bet you their phone's rang like, hey, we need something here, figure something out. So hopefully they'll find a solution and maybe even make it retroactively applicable to some of these cars, just a better oiling solution across the board. There has to be a solution. If the aftermarket can find it, Subaru can find it too, I bet.
Yeah, I hope so. It's certainly the case that their marketing all points to them knowing that this is a car that is going to be used on the track. And in some of their launch marketing, they have Scott Speed, who's a driver who's I don't know if he's a factory driver, but he's somehow affiliated with them. So he was taking a 2022 BRZ around Thunderhill West. So there's actually a helicopter shot of it going through turn 5, which is one of the turns that we see pressure drops. So they surely they've used it on the same track that we have. So it's not like we're using this in a way that's like unavailable to them.
Well, and I'll tell you, I mean, when they launched the car, the new 22 WRX and the BRZ, I had the opportunity to go out to Utah Motorsports campus because that's where they were doing the arrive and drives. So everybody could come in and you could drive the BRZ around. I think it was the east track and the WRX on the west track. And, like you're not doing multiple laps. I mean, it was all very, very controlled. They're not just like throwing you the keys and saying, have fun. That would have been awesome, but they didn't do that. But they still had us go out there. We drove it on the track. We drove both cars in a small autocross. I mean, and the whole purpose was to let the people that are going to be familiar with the car and trying to sell the car communicate what the car is like, communicate what the car can do, to be able to experience it in that environment, because that's the environment that they that they designed and wanted the car to excel in, and it does. I mean, they're both really neat cars, really fun to drive, a great experience to drive.
Yeah.
So I think Subaru's got, every bit as much motivation as any aftermarket company to pinpoint what's going on, do whatever they need to do to tweak it to get it to be better, and then hopefully it'll be better for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great car to drive, and you can drive it out of the box on the track. We've done some things to make it more suitable for the conditions that we're specifically putting it into, and that means inland California summer
Sure.
heat.
Sure.
But if it's winter in California, you don't really need the oil cooler even
Right.
in a lot of conditions. Like, again, everyone should do their homework, understand the conditions, monitor their temperatures if they're using it on the track, and kind of make the decisions for themselves about what they need to do to the car. But I'm still on OEM suspension. I have just minor kind of camber and caster alignment changes on the front. The rear is entirely OEM. The shocks are OEM. So this is a car that's very capable and fun to drive and predictable to drive on the track, like straight
Right
out of the factory.
box.
So
Yeah.
it's an amazing platform. And in addition to that, the running costs are very affordable.
Yeah.
If you compare this to some other people in our group have other cars that they drive more on the street, and one of them is a Supra, but the owner of that car, when he thinks about tracking the Supra and looks at buying a set of tires, it's like 3 times the cost.
Yeah.
And so the consumables are so affordable on this platform that you can instead of paying for tires, you can go to more track days. And so like for a beginner like myself, that's a great formula, and I want to keep doing that. Like, people have asked me, am I considering selling the car and getting something else as a result of this? And really, I just want to find a solution to be able to keep driving this car, because I'm learning so much from it.
And it's going to happen. I mean, there's too many people that this is on their radar now. There's going to be a solution. I guarantee there's probably going to be, I'll guess right now there's going to be 3. I think there's going to two that come out, and then maybe a third down the road. And we're gonna crack this. The aftermarket, the Subaru community aftermarket is just so good at figuring these things out and finding out what the solution is. And what you all have done is again just collected all of this data to really like give the aftermarket, and hopefully Subaru too, a razor's focus on this is what you guys got to look at.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to make the solution come much sooner than if it was just, like I said, a lot of like anecdotal evidence. Like, well, 100 people tracked their BRZs and there was 5 of them that had engine failures. Like, what was it? Was it somebody's using the wrong weight oil? They got the car too hot? Like, what was it going on? When there's not data, there can always be speculation, and you guys have taken that speculation and completely wiped it off the board, and like, this is what you got to look at.
Yeah. And if we could find that solution, and then people know, okay, I can get the car, and there's this 1 or 2 modifications that I have to do, and then it's going to be reliable on track. That's going to be a great place to be in.
For sure. I did have one other question that I wanted to throw out, which is oil analysis. Have you guys considered doing any oil analysis as part of all of this testing?
Yeah, so I've been doing oil analysis basically ever since I started tracking the car.
Okay.
So I did my first 2 oil changes. I've done a lot of oil changes for my car. Has 11,000 miles on it.
Yeah.
I did the first 2. They were included when I purchased the car, and at that time I just was doing some autocross, so I just went with the Subaru 0W20 oil. So I don't have oil analysis from those first 2 changes. But since then, first I went straight to 300V, so Motorsports oil 5W30, and then since then I've chosen 8100 EFE, and that's a 5W30. And I guess a couple things about And so yeah, to answer your question, I've done oil analysis. So far, things are kind of within expected
Tolerance. Okay.
parameters. The moly count on the Motul oils is much higher than 0W20. So when people ask me, do you think about adding a friction modifier or Ceratec or these types of things, I say, well, I don't really have evidence to say that is going to improve the performance, and I know that these oils that I'm using are formulated specifically and have higher moly counts already. So
this is why you use good oil. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't really feel the need to add those. And then just one other thing about oils is some people have said, you need to be running a motorsports oil, otherwise you're going to have a failure on track. And one of my friends who is in our local group here and had a failure had run 300B for the entire duration of his track time. So again, it's an anecdote. Be careful with anecdotes, but 300B is not going to magically solve your problem. And so yeah, we need to find a real solution. But what we have done is there's some other people, including No Street Racing, who are using the same oil. And so that was the 8100 Motul oil. And so that's also useful for our comparison. But there are some specific things that went into that choice. So we looked for an oil that had a high HTHS rating. And so that's a test that they do to see how the oil performs at high temperature and high shear conditions. And these are conditions that would match effectively like what the bearings are going to be experiencing in the engine. And so we're looking for those types of things. It's hard to find concrete evidence that says, this rating is directly related to your, likelihood of spinning a bearing. But we're kind of doing whatever we can in order to make sure that we're preparing ourselves adequately for the conditions that we're going to put these cars in.
Well, and if I heard correctly, so other than testing the oil for like the elements in the oil, viscosity of the oil, how it is held up to the temperatures and so forth, they can look for contents of certain metals that are in the bearings to see another reason to do oil analysis on a car that you're tracking a bunch is like if you start to see an increase in certain alloys that are present in the bearings, then that can be an indicator that, okay, like sometimes you can see in an oil analysis that you're already on the road to a bearing failure before you see kind of like glitters and sparkly stuff in the oil itself.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like you're not seeing a huge increase in those alloys yet.
Yeah, I'm not. There is, so I'm not an expert in this area, and maybe useful caveat. Like I said, I'm a software engineer. I'm not a mechanical engineer. I don't have any specific background in engine.
And I'm not an expert either. But
yeah. But what I've heard is the used oil analysis will detect metals that are kind of very small and suspended in the oil. So if you're seeing, actual debris in your oil when you're changing, or that's not going to be picked up in the tests. So you have to kind of take it with a little bit of grain of salt, but it's at least something. The reason I'm doing it is if I do have a failure, I want to be able to look at that data and say, was this detectable previously?
Interesting.
And, at least that will provide me with more knowledge than I had before. So I'm not looking at that data and saying, well, I feel very confident that I won't have a failure as a result of it, but I am. It's better than not knowing anything.
For sure. And it's, I mean, especially knowing that you guys have that information, definitely hold on to it. Don't lose track of it. And then, there could be a point where that becomes really helpful and relevant as well.
Yeah, exactly.
The last thing, and then I've taken up a lot of your time, and so thank you again, Brian, for coming on and chatting with us here. Because we talked about this a little bit before we actually started recording, I wanted to touch on it at least before we wrap up here, which is the question of short shifting.
Yeah.
Because one of the other things that I've noticed and Ken, you mentioned as we were getting ready to start, is that where you guys are shifting is pretty much close to red line. and that's where you're seeing the pressure drop. And you had an interesting piece of information regarding RPM in this car.
Yeah. Yeah. So the flow of oil is proportional to RPM. And so at high RPMs, there will be higher flow of oil through the engine. So what we've found and what we've kind of been thinking about is essentially at when you're close to red line, that's the maximum flow that's going to be going through the engine.
Because the pump is driven by the crank. So that the
Exactly.
faster that the crank, the faster that the engine is spinning, the faster that the oil pump is spinning. They're connected. That's one of the reasons, to a certain extent, you would go with the dry sump, because you actually can disconnect the oil pump rotor from the crank and you can independently control them. But
Yeah, exactly.
not the case with the stock car.
Yeah. So as you get to those higher RPMs, flow is good. Like this is maybe something that we can mention too, is oil pressure does not protect your engine. Oil flow protects your engine. It's just that it's very hard to measure oil flow. And so we have tools to measure pressure, and they're much cheaper and less invasive to instrument. So and the reason that is if you bored out all the passages in the engine to be twice as big, you would have significantly less oil pressure, even if you had the same flow. But if you think about like what that greater flow does at higher RPMs, is it's going to be pulling whatever oil is in the sump and putting it into the engine faster. And then you're relying on the oil returning to the sump. And oil returning to the sump is affected by lateral G. So if that return is not fast enough at a higher flow, you will reach starvation faster, essentially.
Right. And in part, this is where the rationale for overfilling comes from. Is it so it's like you put your dipstick, or you measure your dipstick oil level when the car is off and it's sitting, and you pull it out, and like let's just say you knew what that line was in the oil pan, then you start the car. Well, now the engine is spinning, the pump is pulling oil out of the sump. Basically the sitting level of the oil is going to drop some, because now oil is being pulled from the bottom of the pan, it's being sent through the engine to do its job. Once it comes out the other end, it has to return. So there's a different equilibrium level when the engine is just running at idle compared to when it's off and everything is back. And then once you start driving it on track and the engine RPM start increasing, that equilibrium level can go down further. And that's where the rationale of putting in an extra half quart or some amount to basically raise the sitting equilibrium level will also raise all of those other equilibrium levels in kind, in theory.
Yeah, that would actually be a fun test to do, is actually take measurements of with the dipstick just at cars off sitting there with engine oil cold, warm, and then maybe at idle, and then maybe higher RPMs as well, just to see what it does.
Not really accurate to get a dipstick reading when the engine is running, because of just all the sloshing around. That's I don't know how you do that.
You wouldn't use it to say, oh, is my oil level correct? But you might use it to say, is there, I don't know. Maybe there's oil running down the dipstick, and it's not going to be useful anyway.
Yeah, or somebody out there listening. The other one, I've seen this more with differentials, but people have been building clear oil pans or clear diff covers so that you can, like in a controlled environment, bring the RPM up or the speed up, and then if your oil pan is clear, here's where it is,
that would be really cool to see.
And then here's what happens. Yeah. So somebody out there, just a suggestion.
Yeah. But we thought of this the short shifting idea, and so we've actually tested it. So we've done laps at Thunder Hill West, for example, where we're going around turn 5, and we're in third gear typically is how I'd take that corner. But if you drop into fourth, you can eliminate the pressure drop. So it's not necessarily the solution that I want as someone who's trying to find a solution to this problem, but the fact that you can drive around the problem, that may be worth considering for people who are want to track the car and want to reduce their level of risk. You don't necessarily need to be close to the red line to do a fast lap even. There's a guy in our group who, whenever we look at his data, he's almost always like a gear up from where everyone else is running, and he's still really, really fast. So you can still do fast laps if you kind of learn how to drive in that way.
That's really interesting, because that's a really important piece of data there, because then I mean, the condition of the car is definitely a contributing factor, but now knowing that if you just shift up a gear, so you're maybe 800 or 1000 RPMs lower in engine speed, but then also in oil pump speed, and as you shift up a gear and your RPMs go down and the oil pump speed goes down, it's either not drawing as much or whatever. The fact that is also related to this dip that you're seeing, that's interesting.
Yeah. So I think it's hard for people to really experiment with and understand unless they have oil pressure instrumentation in their car, unfortunately. One, I guess there's a couple of things that I can mention there. Is one, just knowing that is useful, and if you're not on a fast lap, then be in a higher gear and do less RPM. And generally, like, if people want a rule of thumb, we see the pressure drops most often above 6,000 RPM.
Sure.
Okay. So if you can be in a gear that prevents you from being above 6,000 RPM, and it's not making a big difference to your time, you may want to drive around it. The other thing, I guess a couple other things. One, just if you're interested in learning a lot, getting any kind of data logging is very useful. And I think it's also useful in case you have a failure. Like right now, if you have a failure and you don't have data logging, then the only entity with data about your car is the manufacturer. They're going to have an engineer come and they're going to get black box data, which is going to include the max values for a couple different things like speed and RPM. And it makes sense that they do that. They should do that, and I would do the same thing if I were them. They need to know, did this engine get over revved? Because if it was over revved, that's operating outside of its design parameters. But for you to have data as well means that you're no longer in the dark about what happened to your car, and you can say, hey, I have data from every session on track, and this is the actual data that my car has experienced, and this is why it's not abuse, and this is why I wasn't drag racing with my car. These are just track days for amateurs on a track, and there's no abuse going on here. So one, I think you're going to learn a lot about driving, and maybe one of the things that you can do with data is you can compare your actual lap times with your optimal lap times, which are composed of all these segments on track. So you can learn, okay, even if I'm only able to put down X time, my time optimally, if I took the best of all these sectors, is X minus 2 seconds or something. So okay, I'm already driving in a way where I can be 2 seconds faster.
Go ahead.
And then I think one of our goals as well, and our goals being this kind of greater community that I'm in, is to make oil pressure data more accessible to more people. So we don't really have a solution right now. The solution that is in my car took hours of labor for No Street Racing to build, and then but if we can, he's actually working on creating solutions that will be very affordable for people to put in their own cars. So hopefully we'll be able to have solutions for people where they can kind of like drop these components in and have the same data available to them.
Sure. It's funny, like, having had a lot of conversations about cars and driving and taking a car to the track and all that sort of things, there's themes that come up, and data is one of those things that it just always keeps coming up. And so for us in our race car, we just put in a standalone that now, like, whatever sensors you want, you just run them to the standalone, and you just tell the standalone what the sensor is, and it records it. So now in the race car, we've got oil temperature, oil pressure, coolant pressure, crankcase pressure, I think fuel pressure, like just this whole slew of sensors that are doing nothing but looking at what the engine is going on.
Yeah,
And
it's really cool.
we took it to the track for the first time a few weeks ago with our tuner so that we could basically get the car into operating condition. Because one of the reasons that we put all the sensors on in the first place is so that now if we have all of this data that the ECU is seeing, we can set limits. So we can basically try and find out what normal is, and then if some of these values get abnormal, then we can actually have the ECU go into like a fail-safe mode to protect the engine. And so we had to go out there and figure out what normal was and start playing around with some of these settings. And it was so enlightening. It's basically what you're doing with oil pressure and temperature. To see the data in context it's a whole nother thing. Like an oil pressure gauge and an oil temperature gauge are certainly helpful. Like absolutely. Like if you don't have any gauges and you want to put a gauge on your car, oil temperature and pressure are probably the first two that you should put on probably any car that you're going to take to the track. The thing with a gauge where it's just a needle that's moving though is that it will give you information, but the information is only as helpful as the attention that you can pay to the gauge in the instant. So like it's something like you're trying to drive the car, you're trying to make a lap time, you're going around a right-hand corner, and maybe you can have like an alert or something set up in the gauge so you'll see a flash of light. But to be in that circumstance, to see the flash of light and look at the gauge, not go off the track, not hit somebody, and actually go, aha, 28 PSI, and then carry on about your business.
Yeah.
It's better information than nothing. And like a lot of gauges have high lows, kind of like what you were describing earlier. So maybe you can see what your minimum was. But like to actually be able to collect data and look at it in context with everything else that the car is doing, it's been really eye-opening for us. So like, yeah, if you guys can figure out more ways to kind of use that aim, say it was the aim dash or
yeah, so we have the aim solo 2 data
yeah.
logger, and then we have the AEM pressure sensor, and then in between there is the custom solution that No Street Racing 86 has built. And so what that does is it takes the analog signal from the pressure sensor, so that's coming over low voltage, just conductors, wires, and then that goes into analog to digital converter. So then we have basically representation in this dedicated microcontroller unit. So basically like a little circuit board, and that has firmware that can read those voltages and then translate that into pressures.
And then put on the CAN bus.
It injects it into the CAN bus. So the CAN bus is this kind of protocol that all modern cars have had for a while, where all these data feeds are coming on them. And so that is able to inject this additional data feed into the CAN bus. And then we just record it on the AIM Solo 2, just like any other data feed. So you have to set it up on the AIM Solo 2 to also recognize that there's an additional signal coming on the CAN bus. But once you do that, then you have this really nicely integrated solution that you don't really have to think about. And you also can display it on the little device. It's it's a fairly small screen, but for me, it acts as a gauge as well right now. So I don't have a separate oil pressure gauge. But yeah, for me, this is like a really nice way to do it, because then when you're on the track, you just think about driving. And as someone with, like I've said, like 10 track days, I don't have a lot of extra capacity. I'm not Fernando Alonso watching Lance Stroll do passes on track,
And arguably, as you're driving, you really shouldn't. I mean, you should be focused on what you're doing with the car, where the car is. And that's, I mean, that was another reason for us to go to the standalone, is like, let the standalone do all the data collection and look at everything so that our driver can just get on with the business of driving. And then setting up the fail-safe. So like, okay, if something really does go off the rails, he's just doing his driving, and then the car protects itself, and he can just go, well, what happened? But he doesn't have to like pay attention to a flashing light, realize that means I have to push this button or do whatever. It's like, it just shuts everything down for you.
The kind of like the pressure drops are always happening at moments where you have a lot of lateral G. And so those are typically the moments where I don't want to be distracted by like anything else going on. So
yeah, you've got higher priorities at that point in the driver's seat. Yeah,
exactly.
for sure. Well, very cool. Well, Brian, again, thanks for everything you guys are doing. Like all of you guys, to put all this data together. Thanks to you for putting it together in such a great format and putting up on our YouTube page. And like, again, there'll be links in the description here. And really excited to see what the next step is, what you guys are able to try to develop, to work out, and then test and like find a solution or help vet the solution. Yeah, you guys have kind of put yourselves right in the middle of it, and hopefully it's exciting for you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, everyone who I've been collaborating with on this also just wants to find a solution, and the sooner we can do that, the happier we'll be. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, and yeah, looking forward to more tests in the future.
Absolutely. We'll stay tuned. We'll pay attention to everything that you're doing, and then I don't know, depending on how things go, we'll maybe, hopefully, not too long from now, bring it back on and talk about the solution that you guys found.
Yeah, so I look forward to it.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Brian, for all your time. Thanks everybody home for watching, for listening. Thanks for your support as always. And until next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.